Welcome forward here. I'd like to share this little treasure from Dale Carnegie. It's entitled The Little Recognized Secret of Success. The Little Recognized Secret of Success by Dale Carnegie. One morning, years ago, I walked along the campus of the State Teachers College at Warrensburg, Missouri, and stopped to chat with a friend of mine, Frank Self. Little did I realize then that the chat was to have a profound effect upon all the days of my years. If I had not met Frank Self that morning, I would probably have been a superintendent of some high school or college in the Middle West, for I spent 4 years in college for training teachers. During our talk, Frank Self told me that the previous summer he had been selling courses for the international correspondence schools. I was astounded when he told me that they paid him $2 a day for hotel expenses and a commission for all the courses he sold. $2 a day for hotel expenses? That very thought of it excited me. $2 a day was all I could hope to make as a teacher in some county town, and out of all that $2 I would have to pay room and board. Here was a way to make money quickly. I wondered how long this kind of high finance has been going on. It couldn't be done, but I didn't know. I didn't know that. The nearest office of the International Correspondence School was in Denver. I had never been in a big city. I didn't know that I couldn't get a position with the ICS by merely writing a letter to Denver office of the company. Since I was too dumb to know it couldn't have been done, I did it. I learned afterwards that I got the position solely because I had told in my letter that I had won first honors in several public speaking and debate contests in college. The International Correspondence School felt that I was a lad who could win debates in school ought to be able to sell anything. I go from farming to selling. So I left the farm forever. That morning I entered a new world, a world where there were no cows to milk, no weeds to destroy, no wood to cut, no cow to manure to be pitched out of the cow's shed, and a strange world, a competitive world, and a tough world, the world of selling. The first night in Denver, I slept in a shabby, furnished room of a grocery store. I paid a quarter or maybe 50 cents for it. I had been warned about the city slickers, and I knew that the big cities were full of gangsters and pickpockets just waiting for a farm boy like me. I had $28 pinned in a little cloth bag which my mother made. It hung around my neck under my shirt. I was so afraid to turn out that light for fear I might be robbed. A few hours later I woke with a start. Someone was pounding at my door. The city slickers were after me, and, "Here I am," I said to myself, "being robbed, maybe being murdered, the first night in a big city," When I discovered that it was merely the night watchman ordering me to turn out the light, I could have been buried my head up under the bedclothes in embarrassment. I started as a salesman a few days later. I was given a territory among the sandhills of western Nebraska, and an impossible territory. My headquarters were at Alliance. Charles Schwab himself couldn't have sold educational courses to the potato farmers and ranchers along the sandhills of western Nebraska. I was desperate. Here I was, failing at the first job I had after college. I was so desperate that I even stopped cattle ranchers on the streets and asked them if they didn't want to study electrical engineering or correspondence. And as I look back at it now, it seems like something out of a Gilbert and Sullivan. Someone told me of a ranch hand several miles out in the country who was interested in getting more education. Since I couldn't afford to hire a team of lively stable horses to take me out to my prospect, I walked for several miles. What happened? Nothing. All I got out of it was sore feet. I went back to my lonely room and threw myself across the bed and wept in despair. I was ashamed to go home and admit that I had failed in my first undertaking. I hated to keep on and I hated to stop. I saw a man painting a barn. I tried to sell him a course and a sign of painting, and he thought was being funny. I saw a lineman climbing a telephone pole. I pleaded with him to become an electrical engineer by mail. And since he was up a pole and couldn't get away from me, he began asking questions. He took me to his home, and his mother and his father urged him to get more education. So he bought a course of electrical engineer and paid me 88 cash for it, the first and only one I ever sold for the International Correspondence School. I shall always be grateful to a cracker salesman I met one night in a grocery store in Scuff Bluff, Nebraska. When I told him that what I was doing, he said, "Son, you haven't got a real job at all. You don't have to any repeat sales." And then he told me to get a job selling some food product or for which there was a demand. I resolved then and there that I would get a job selling ham and bacon and lard for Armour or Switch. Since I hadn't the money to buy a ticket to Omaha, I figured a way to get there without cash. I knew that if a farmer shipped a carload of cattle or hogs or horses, he got 2 tickets free, so I went to the stockyards in Alliance, Nebraska, and found a man who was shipping a carload of range horses to Omaha and told him that, if he would give me a ticket, I would help him water and feed the horses and keep them off their feet so they wouldn't get trampled to death. I wanted a job selling bacon and lard and soap for Armour or Swift. I realized that I didn't know how to apply for a job or to get some experience in applying for a job. I stopped on my way to South Omaha and applied for a job that I really didn't want at all. A job as a traveling salesman for a wholesale warehouse hardware company. I didn't get the job, but I did get the experience I needed. When I arrived in South Omaha, both Chudday and the Omaha Packing Company felt that they struggled along somehow without my services as a salesman, but the sales manager of Armour and Company, Rufus E. Harris, was a reckless man. He took chances. He hired me to sell bacon and ham and beef, canned meats, cheese to the butcher shops and grocery stores in South Dakota. Armour had 27 traveling men selling Armour products in the Midwest. My salary was $17.31 per week, plus traveling expenses. When I wrote the thrilling news to my parents, they could hardly believe it. There had been periods on the farm that when Father hadn't made that much in an entire year. Father warned me that Armour and Company wouldn't keep on paying that much money very long, and I feared he was right. My territory covered practically all of the state of South Dakota from Minnesota line to the Black Hills. For some unknown reason, every salesman who ever tried to sell Armour products in that territory had failed. It now stood at the very bottom of the 27 sales territory handled by the South Omaha branch. That was the reason I got it. Within 2 weeks, I raised that territory from 27th place to first place. The day I received a letter of congratulations from my boss saying, quote, "You have achieved what seemed impossible," End of quote. I had to go out and buy a bigger hat. 6 months later, when I was 22, Armour offered to make me manager of their branch house in Des Moines, Iowa. They told me I was the youngest man who had ever been offered such a position by Armour and Company. I didn't accept it because I had already decided to come to New York to study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. In parentheses is said, I was on the stage for a year. Let us pass over that year in the silence it deserves. End of parentheses. Whatever success I had as an Armour salesman was due almost entirely to my enthusiasm, my eagerness to work day and night to make good. I was determined to make good no matter what the cost, because I knew that if I failed, I would have to go home and admit failure in the first real job I ever had. Besides, all my work was far more interesting and far more lucrative than milking cows, shucking corn, and cleaning out the hen house on the farm. I was so excited I probably worked harder than other salesmen in South Dakota. I had to travel on the caboose of a freight train. While the train was switching cars and unloading freights, I would run uptown and call on the butcher shops and grocery stores. I'd bet the townspeople got many a smile out of my tail flying in the winds as I dashed back up to the moving train and swung on the platform. The wonder was that I didn't lose my grip and slip under the train and lose my leg. And the summer heat rose to over 100 on the sun-parched plains, and in the winter the thermometer registered 40 below zero. One day the snow was so deep and the cold was so intense that even a freight wouldn't run. However, I didn't know it, so I dashed down to the depot as usual, and in the 10-minute run I froze both my ears. Scores of microscopic blood vessels in my ears burst, and the wonder is that I didn't lose both my ears. They were injured so severely that almost a half a century later my ears pained me on a cold day, so I had to walk down the street with my hands cupped over them. Why am I telling you this? Simply because I hope to show you that my determination to make good was so intense that nothing could stop me. I regret to say that I did not inherit my superior intelligence from my ancestors, but I did develop a superior enthusiasm from my mother. An enthusiasm important to sell? Yes. Real, honest, genuine, heartfelt enthusiasm is one of the most potent factors of success in almost any undertaking. Charles Schwab, a man who was paid a salary of $1 million a year, told me that the secret of his success was enthusiasms. He declared that a man can succeed at almost anything for which he has unlimited enthusiasm. I once interviewed Frederick Williamson on a radio program. He was, at the time, president of the New York Central Railway. When I asked him for his recipe for success, he said, quote, "The longer I live, the more certain I am that enthusiasm is the little recognized secret of success. The difference in actual skill and ability and intelligence between those who succeed and those who fail is usually neither wide nor striking, but if two men are nearly equal matched, the man who is enthusiastic will find the scales tipped in his favor, and a man of a second-rate ability with enthusiasm will often outstrip one of the first-rate abilities without enthusiasm." End of quote. Once I heard a famous psychologist, in discussing Army aptitude tests, remark that the IQ test has one important shortcoming. They fail to measure emotional drive. according to the IQ tests. A man with a low score is usually rated as fit for only menial jobs, while a high score is considered practically a guarantee of success. You and I know how misleading that is. I have seen men with low IQs suddenly set on fire by a new idea or a new line of work. It gives them, quote, emotional drive, end quote, which sends them on to a great success. And I have seen men with high IQs fail miserably. When Mark Twain was asked the reason for his success, he replied, quote, I was born excited, end quote. The late William Lyon Phelps, one of the most popular teachers in the history of Yale, told me almost the same thing. Professor Phelps wrote a book entitled The Excitement of Teaching. And on page 21 of that book he said, quote, with me, teaching is more than an art or an occupation. It is a passion. I love to teach as a painter loves to paint, as a singer loves to sing, as a poet loves to write. And before I get out of bed in the morning, I think of the ardent delight in my first group of students. One of the chief reasons for success in life is the ability to maintain a daily interest in one's work, to have a chronic enthusiasm, to regard each day as important. End quote. That is one of the chief reasons for success in any undertaking. Yes, that is true, even for a salesman. One summer evening several years ago, I studied the salesmanship of two stargazing merchants who set up a telescope on the 42nd Street opposite the public library in New York. One charged 10 cents for a look at the moon. The other man, who had a slightly larger telescope, charged a quarter. The man who charged a quarter was getting 4 times as many customers as the man who charged only 10 cents. And to be sure, you got a slightly better view with the 25-cent telescope, but the main reason for the financial success of this higher-priced telescope was the personality of the man in charge of it. He radiated enthusiasm. He talked about looking up at the moon with such excitement that one would, if necessary, have passed up his dinner in order to see it. The man with the 10-cent telescope said nothing. He just merely took orders. This experience to me on an astronomical example of the value of enthusiasm. When Sir Edward Victor Appleton, who had been knighted by the King of England and awarded Nobel Prize in Physics, when this great scientist was made Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, Time magazine sent him a wireless message asking if he had any recipes for success. Quote, yes, end quote, he replied. Quote, enthusiasm. I rate that even ahead of professional skill. End quote. I don't know of any in the world that would do more for you than enthusiasm. Thomas A. Edison said, quote, when a man dies, if he can pass enthusiasm along to his children, he has left them in a state of incalculable value. End quote. Experience proves that to be true. It is more than wealth, for enthusiasm will produce wealth. Not only wealth, but a great zest for living. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is considered to be the greatest of American philosophers, saw the value of enthusiasm. In one of his essays he wrote, quote, every great and commanding moment in the annals of the world is the triumph of some enthusiasm. End quote. Two men in an office have exactly the same kind of jobs. One at work in his half-hearted way, as if bored by it and glad to have the hands of the clock point to 5. The other does his work with gusto. He finds it exciting. He finds each day an adventure. Now, which do you think is going to do better at work? Which one is going to get ahead? John James Audubon was the greatest naturalist that America has ever produced, and the great thing that he passed on to his country, this country, was his bird drawings. Some of them have been sold as high as $5,000. He would disappear into the wilderness and be gone for months, but he would return with more wonderful drawings of birds. Once when he came back, he opened his trunk where he had stored his precious drawings and found that the rat had been among them and had gnawed and defaced them, destroying works of months. A friend offered solace for the blow, but solace wasn't necessary for Audubon, for he said, quote, "They have destroyed my drawings. They haven't destroyed my enthusiasm." End of quote. And they had not, for he went ahead and produced after that some of his greatest watercolors. Charles F. Ketterling, the great inventor, said, quote, "We are just coming into an era where in every conceivable field there are opportunities such as were never dreamed of. These opportunities will go to the men and women who have enthusiasm." End of quote. During World War I, Alexander de Seversky went up in a fighting plane on his first trip. He had been up only a few minutes when he had shot down and fell into the Gulf of Riga. Picked up by a Russian battleship, he was rushed to a hospital where a leg was amputated. When he again became conscious, they asked him what he wanted to do. He said, quote, "I want to fly." That is enthusiasm. The enthusiasm that accomplishes. But enthusiasm is more than just a zest for work. It is for the whole of life and living. If you have it, you have a priceless possession. Cherish it. And thus concludes The Little Recognized Secret of Success by Dale Carnegie.